All right, I think we can go ahead and get started now that we've given it a few minutes for people to start trickling in. Welcome everyone, Sam. It's good to see that, we have a large showing for this. My name is Naveen. I'm with the Palestinian Youth Movement here in Dallas, and I'm going to be moderating today. And we have our lovely facilitators, Rhiannon and Noura, both with the PYM. And I'll go ahead and pass it over to them in a second. I want to make sure that, we are all like very familiar with what we're doing here. So obviously the JNF here in the United States plans to convene its global conference for Israel here at the Hilton Anatole in Dallas from the 14th to the 17th. They are a colonial power and they're unapologetic about that approach that they take and their blatant racism. They have been proponents of the ongoing genocide that we're currently facing, yet they consider themselves to be a voice for Israel and stand together really proudly to support building a Jewish homeland. And so we're in a point where the Zionist entity has, been bombarding and starving, maiming and murdering hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza, and in broader Palestine. And I want to make sure that, we meet our goals today and familiarizing ourselves with this awful organization and learn just what we can do to confront Zionism in every way that it manifests in our locales. So I'll go ahead and pass it on to Rhi and Noura. Thank you.
Thanks, Naveen. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Naveen or Noura, can you give a thumbs up that you can hear me? Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, everybody, for being here. This is so important. Naveen, we can go to the next slide just for grounding. Just want to take a step beyond what Naveen told us already. We all know we're here to learn about the JNF and its history and present day involvement in land theft and colonialism in Palestine. But just to ground us in sort of like currently what's happening with this conference and sort of what our role is, like Naveen referenced, I think a lot, what we're facing as a Palestinian liberation movement in this moment, especially here in the far diaspora, is maybe a little bit of demoralization and demobilization. It's been over a year. We haven't stopped the genocide. And so, there's some necessary reflection that has to be done about what our role is. We just went through the election, a lot of people feeling demoralized, demobilized, maybe afraid about the repression that's to come with another fascist administration in the U.S., let's say. And I think the JNF conference gives us exactly the target that Naveen was talking about, that there is work to be done. It's right in our backyard, and our role and responsibility, our duty to the people in Palestine right now as Palestinians and people who are in struggle with us is to confront Zionism wherever it is. And so just want to ground us in what we're doing, why we're doing this today. And then maybe just a little bit of grounding for the JNF. What is the JNF if you've never heard of it before? Today the Jewish National Fund
Recording in progress.
Beautiful. Today, the Jewish National Fund collects millions of dollars in tax-exempt donations that it uses in Israel for quote-unquote development projects. These projects are carried out largely on lands that were illegally taken, stolen from Palestinian owners. And the JNF holds land, leases it to Jews only or Jewish organizations or companies under Jewish control. Non-Jews are prohibited from leasing, using, working on JNF lands. It actively works with the IOF, and it continues to steal land from Palestinians in the West Bank. It funds and administers the expansion of illegal settlements across historic Palestine. That's what we're going to be talking about today. And I just want to say, you do not have to spend years of research. I'm not a historian by trade or training or expertise. You don't have to spend years of research to put these things together and find out what the JNF does. The JNF has been explicit. It is upfront and open in its goals from the time of its founding to this day. But at the same time, the JNF is rarely discussed as what it is, which is a primary architect of the colonization of Palestine. So this is our primary objective, our primary intervention in being here today and doing this teach-in, that you understand the way Palestine was stolen, not quote unquote, just by the creation of the state of Israel in 1948, but additionally by non-state actors, corporations, organizations, law and policy decisions that date back decades before the Nakba in 48, right? And so understanding the JNF is actually understanding the machinations of imperialism and how colonization works and how it's carried out. So let's get into the history of the JNF. You can go to the next slide, Naveen. Just to talk about the founding, the idea of having a land acquisition fund, a fund that was going to work on getting land in Palestine and for colonizing Palestine, that was proposed at the Zionist conference in 1884. That proposal was for a body that would, quote, redeem the land of Israel from foreigners in order to turn it into a national acquisition that would not be for sale, but would rather be for leasehold only. We're going to talk about this idea of like not selling. JNF doesn't sell a lot of its land, but it leases a lot of its land. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit, but really want to note the use of the word redeem the land, the identification of quote unquote foreigners on the land in Palestine, when actually these folks were meeting in Switzerland and they're the foreigners who are planning on colonizing Palestine. This at the time in the late 1800s, the turn of the 20th century, this is colonizer language, explicitly and openly so, at a time when it was not shameful to be upfront that you intended to colonize a land from Europe or the United States. So the JNF, this proposal was actually passed at the World Zionist Conference in 1901. It was passed as a colonial arm, this body of the World Zionist Organization. And the original founding documents in 1901, again, this explicitness with the colonization goals, said that the JNF's, quote, primary objective is to, quote, purchase, take on lease or in exchange, or otherwise acquire any lands, forests, rights of possession, and others in Palestine and surrounding areas for the purpose of settling Jews on such land. Again, want to underscore from the beginning, you can look these up very, very easily. From the beginning, this is explicit. The JNF is explicit in its aims of Jewish exclusivity and colonization. Okay, we can go to the next slide and kind of talk about from the founding throughout the British mandatory period. So this is, the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, leading up to 1948 and the Nakba. The JNF primarily, this is speaking in broad strokes, but during this time, let's say the first 30 to 40 years of the 20th century, the JNF was primarily acquiring land by purchasing it or being gifted land in Palestine. Now, like I mentioned before, the JNF wasn't purchasing land to sell it to Jewish settlers, but to lease it. At this time, the JNF mostly held land in trust for Jewish people, for Jewish settlers who were coming into Palestine. So the JNF is the owner of the land and then would lease it to settlers for land development and building on the land to encourage more settlement. But meanwhile, we want to note with this leasing relationship, the JNF is constantly accruing capital, land ownership, in addition to any lease payments that it was making on leased land to settlers. So I want to open it up maybe to just a little bit of discussion, or I'm going to pose a question and maybe people can just put it in the chat, their thoughts about this. So we just said, the JNF was purchasing land. And there's this argument that purchasing land means like, okay, it wasn't stolen then, right? This is a legal transfer of ownership. If landowners were compensated for their property, then nothing unfair or unjust happened. And so you can raise your hand if you like, or maybe just put some quick thoughts in the chat. Who does that argument serve? If we say like, oh, well, land was purchased legally, who does that argument actually serve? And maybe like if you can think of why presenting the JNF's actions at this time as like just depolitical purchase of land, why is that ultimately inaccurate? Or maybe you can think of examples of other historical colonial projects where land theft happened through supposedly legal means. Just take a second. I don't see in the chat. Yeah, it reminds me of what the colonizer did here in the United States. Who it serves non-Indigenous settlers. That's exactly right. Similar to how settlers purchase land here in America, stolen from Indigenous people. And we see people choked out of resources all the time. Folks are cornered into relinquishing their property. Exactly, exactly. It serves the occupier. Legal hardly means moral. Incredible. Yes, just because something is legal does not mean it is just, does not mean it is morally correct. The Louisiana Purchase is a great example, great historical example. Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, great, guys. So that's really important to point out about the JNF's activities, again, in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. So it's important that, we understand that even quote unquote, like the simple purchase of Palestinian land was part of a political project. It was the project of settler colonialism. And every settler colonial project has three goals. That's seize land, exploit the natural resources of the conquered country, and then three, to reduce or eliminate the country's indigenous inhabitants, or to exploit them economically as a source of cheap labor. All three of these things have been done by the JNF, and certainly we already understand, if you're in this audience, that the Zionist entity does this as a settler colonial project. This is to highlight that the JNF does it on behalf of the Zionist entity. Maybe moving on from that point in transitioning, the JNF was not ever simply purchasing land. It was building that settler colonial project in conjunction with imperial powers under the guise of, we're just buying land, right? From our framework, that is still land theft. And, consider, just like people were talking about in the chat, consider what we think of as legitimate just because of who's doing it and because it's quote unquote or technically legal at the time. Realizing that like kind of smaller land purchases weren't going to gain enough land to establish a Jewish majority state, the JNF began to actively take part in a mass scale in the displacement of Palestinians. In the lead up to the Nakba, law and policy sort of intensify the JNF's land acquisition. So prior to 1920, the JNF's land acquisitions were still pretty modest. And again, it was during the British Mandatory period that they decided, and the British Mandatory government helped them acquire more land. So the British Mandatory government came through for the JNF big time, especially in the year 1920. The British civil administration in Palestine issued a land transfer ordinance, and the effect of that ordinance was to make it easier for Jews to purchase land in Palestine. Land registry offices were opened the same year, and that removed legal obstacles to the transfer of ownership. All of a sudden, there were offices with which new Jewish immigrants and Jewish settlers could come and establish title, legal ownership of land. And then, in addition, that British civil administration in 1920, the same year, certified the JNF as having the purpose of public utility. That's the quote, that the JNF as an organization has a public purpose, and so is protected as like a business. And it was registered as a company that was authorized to engage in purchasing and developing land in Palestine. So it gives it like the heft, the power, the backing of the British Mandatory government. At this time, 1920, I want to make a quick note about the history of our people's resistance. Those exact policy changes, those three policy changes in 1920, are one of the direct causes of a Palestinian rebellion in 1921. So the colonization of Palestine doesn't start in 1948, neither does our resistance to that colonization. So let's go back to this idea of like civil administration, though, and the British Mandatory government backing the JNF with this all of the sudden civil administration and legal like legitimacy. The creation of that civil administration through law and policy, the people and the offices that enact and enforce such things, that is how colonization is actually carried out. That's how colonization is effectuated, right? The JNF still does this today, civil administration of illegal settlements and land theft in Palestine. And we're going to talk about today's actions or activities of the JNF in just a little bit. But again, want to highlight, just civil administration, they have the power to buy and sell or lease land, to quote unquote develop land. Those are not depolitical or objective or work that's disconnected from the process of ethnic cleansing that actually is the process that facilitates and supports ethnic cleansing and dispossession. So as a result of these policies, the JNF's land holdings were suddenly like exponentially increased through the 1920s and 1930s. Their land holdings increased tenfold from 1920 to 1930. That number doubled by 1940, and that number doubled again by May of 1948. So that by the time that the state of Israel was officially created in May of 1948, the JNF had nearly 1 million dunim, which is like 250,000 acres under its control in historic Palestine. Remember, I'm in Texas, 250,000 acres, maybe not that much. This is a very small country. So the JNF had already started to own and control and acquire a lot of land before 1948. Okay, Naveen, we can go to the next slide because I think it's appropriate now to talk about the JNF's role in ethnic cleansing, not just acquiring the land, but really what it was doing to facilitate and administer, right, ethnic cleansing. We've talked about how the JNF has really always been explicit in its aim to colonize Palestine. That, of course, one of the goals of any settler colonial project is to depopulate or eliminate a land's indigenous population. The JNF was upfront in this goal as well, not just colonization, but also to depopulate and to remove Palestinians from the land. Throughout the Nakba and afterwards, even leading up to it, the JNF trained settlers to establish Jewish-only agricultural settlements on the Palestinian land it had colonized. The JNF had a place names committee that was tasked with renaming Palestinian villages to eradicate any mention of Palestinian presence. And Joseph Weitz in 1941, Joseph Weitz is at the time the land director for the JNF. He said in 1941, this is 7 years before the creation of the State of Israel, from now on, it's necessary to work on a secret but fundamental plan to move the Arabs from here, which would be implemented under the supervision of an American Anglo committee. So you see the explicit, not just being explicit about the removal of Palestinians, the removal of Arabs, but also very explicit about the partnership with Western powers and how that was going to be executed. I want to share another, I think we can go to the next slide, Naveen. There's another quote there, which is a long one, but I'll read it, no worries. In 1940, Joseph Weitz, the same person, wrote, "It should be clear to us that there's no room in Palestine for these two peoples. No development will bring us to our goal of independent nationhood in this small country. Without the Arabs, the land will become wide and spacious for us. With the Arabs, the land remains sparse and cramped. There is no room here for compromises. The way is to transfer the Arabs from here to the neighboring countries, all of them. Not one village, not one tribe should be left. There is no other way." So again, this is the JNF's land director, sort of very upfront about what the goals are, including the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian villages. Want to go back to the JNF's role in this quote unquote like civil administration. Leading up to the Nakba, part of that civil administration work that the JNF did was creating what were called village files. Those village files were the compilation of information that the JNF had collected by surveying existing Palestinian villages, right? They noted population numbers, they noted the leaders of those villages, they noted agricultural systems, primary markets, and people's livelihoods in those villages. And that was done for hundreds of Palestinian villages. During the Nakba then, 1947, 1948, those village files were handed over to Zionist militias, and they were used as a central source of military intelligence for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. One example is that, Palestinians who were named in the village files as having been resistant or actively resisting British and Zionist colonization, they were executed by Zionist forces. That was information that was handed over to those militias by the JNF in those village files. One more thing, about the relationship between the JNF and the newly created Israeli state. David Ben-Gurion in 1948, he would become the first prime minister of Israel, told JNF leaders at the outbreak of the 1948 war, the war will give us the land. Concepts of ours and not ours are peacetime concepts only, and they lose their meaning during war. So yeah, just this sort of connection between, yes, state institutions, state actors, non-state actors, and they're being extremely clear with one another about what the project is. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So just continuing on the JNF's role in ethnic cleansing, the JNF really begins to transform into outright like a land takeover organization, and it works hand in hand, like I just said, with the Israeli state and military to dispossess and displace Palestinians, and also to make that process permanent. One of the primary roles that the JNF has played historically in Palestine is that after mass dispossession and mass expulsion events of Palestinians from historic Palestine, the JNF has acted after those events to make that dispossession and displacement and expulsion permanent, to make it impossible for Palestinians to return. So just talking, let's get into that a little bit. One example is that immediately after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, the JNF presented a plan to depopulate and then repopulate with its own settlers an initial 40 Palestinian villages. This was days after the creation of the State of Israel, and this would happen over and over again. They wanted to work with the militias to depopulate those Palestinians. Often they would put them in camps that were mere kilometers from their homes, and then they would resettle immigrant Jews in those villages. But there was also and always a fear that Palestinians were going to return, right? They would obviously want their land back. And if they were allowed to return or be in the area, or then they would demand that they get their land and their homes back. So, and not to mention that at the time there was some international pressure to allow refugees to return. So the JNF hatched a plan in conjunction with the Israeli state to prevent that from happening. So in order to prevent the return of Palestinians, the JNF made the decision to start completely destroying villages, to raze them to the ground, to make them rubble. And so in May 1949, they called, there was 41 destroyed villages, and the JNF ordered that those quote unquote heaps of rubble would be removed, because the heaps of rubble remained as a sign of the fact that there had previously been villages there, right? This happened in the Jerusalem and Jaffa area in between those two cities, and also on the southern coastal plain of Palestine, which was actually, in fact, allocated for the Arab state at that time in the partition plan. The JNF was still destroying and then removing any sign of that destruction of Palestinian villages there. Not coincidentally, this area, that south coastal plain, is adjacent to Gaza, where masses of refugees were pushed. And so you see this accumulation today in like, what is Gaza? Who is there? They are a majority of the people in Gaza were people displaced from all their areas of historic Palestine. The JNF was a lead architect of that process. And so, really, to say nothing of the destruction of like historical sites, buildings in Jaffa, for example, where my grandmother is from, that had been there for hundreds or even thousands of years. Palestinian homes and villages were looted, and their wealth was stolen by the militias, by the JNF, and by the Israeli state. Ben-Gurion, in his war diary at various times throughout 1948, mentions, quote unquote, robbing the Arabs, quote unquote, complete looting of Wadi Nisnas in Haifa, quote unquote, looting in Jerusalem, quote unquote, looting and rape. This was obvious at the time, upfront at the time about what was happening, and the JNF was part of looting Palestinian homes and villages, and that is part of its wealth and capital accumulation today. So again, want to highlight, how laws and policy that greenlit and allowed this land theft and ethnic cleansing provided really like retroactive justification and permission for what the JNF was doing. So to kind of like skirt the appearance of outright land theft, the new Israeli government appointed in like the earlier, it might have been 1948 or 1949 or just after, the Israeli government appointed a custodian of abandoned property, right? And they would pass quote unquote absentee laws, which governed how land that had been stolen from Palestinians would be administered. And so that custodian of appointed property, this was like a government official in the newly created state of Israel. That person would act in the place of the former owners. So they were in the role of like collecting and recording the property and then freezing it under one authority. And this was all under the lie that they were like legitimately holding that property in order to eventually compensate those Palestinian landowners that had quote unquote like left their land or abandoned their land. What actually happened is that authority, that office, then sold that land, and they were only allowed to sell it to the JNF or the Israeli state, and then held the money that they got from the JNF, again, under the lie that they would give that money to former Palestinian owners of that land who had been expelled or massacred. That money, of course, was never given to the Palestinian owners. And in the process, the JNF had like clear title, had legally purchased that land. And so they got clear title to the land, and they, through that process, guaranteed that they wouldn't be held liable for that land theft. And see too with the flow, I just want to highlight like seeing the flow of capital, right? The Israeli state said, we have this new office that's going to administer all of this quote unquote abandoned land. Oh, but we can only sell it to the JNF. The JNF gives the Israeli government the money for the land. The Israeli government holds on to that money. The JNF gets land, right? And so it's this flow and connection between all of these institutions that are effectuating, again, the settler colonial project. Okay, let's go to the next slide really quick. Let's talk about the JNF today. I want to go over kind of three things. What the JNF has done since the Nakba, continues to do today, quite outright, quite explicitly, quite openly. There's afforestation projects we're going to talk about. This is a cover for ethnic cleansing. There's, again, that continuation of the civil administration and funding for settlements, often settlements that are, of course, recognized as illegal under international law. And then want to get into a little bit the tax exempt status, how the JNF is technically and legally in the United States and other countries outside of Israel, a nonprofit organization, a quote unquote charitable organization, which is wild. We can go to the next slide. Let's talk about kind of green colonialism and these afforestation projects. So the project of disappearing Palestinian people from their land and then disappearing, like we talked about, any history or any sign that they had been there before, that took many forms. But one primary way that it was done was through the JNF's afforestation projects, where they planted forests. I want to give an example. The Yatir forest in so-called Israel today is an entirely planted woodland pine tree forest in the Naqab, the desert. Again, a planted forest in the desert is 4 million trees planted by the JNF. And, it's billed as sort of like a park, a beautiful forest. But actually it was planted by the JNF in the 1960s as part of a really long-standing campaign that pitched tree planting in Israel to Jews in the US especially, but also all over the world, and pitched that campaign as like a moral act of environmentalism and also a way to memorialize loved ones. Of course, never mind that Palestinians were the lost loved ones. Palestinians had been expelled from that land because the Yatir forest was actually planted on top of Bedouin lands and Palestinian villages that had been ethnically cleansed and razed when the JNF's forestry workers in the 50s and 60s arrived, and they were accompanied by the Israeli military, armed with bullets and tear gas. And so these afforestation projects have taken place all over historic Palestine, and they're used by the JNF to this day to uproot Palestinians, to forcibly limit the growth of Palestinian communities, and to hide evidence of destroyed Palestinian communities. And so Noura is going to talk about the JNF like myth making and propaganda in a minute. But this ethnic cleansing and erasure is really laundered through massive greenwashing campaigns, this kind of quote unquote green colonialism, that you hide your colonialist activity by calling it environmental. And this has been called a charity to malice pipeline. And meanwhile, we have to mention these forests, the JNF is actually committing ecocide of native Palestinian land. Again, these are non-native pine tree forests in the desert. This is ruining Palestinian ecology. Naveen, if you could actually go back to the previous slide, just to go over the last two. Yeah, thank you. Want to talk really quickly about the civil administration that the JNF does in illegal settlements. What this looks like is, despite, you can go to the JNF website, and with this framework, I think it's quite clear the language they use, like what they're talking about. But the JNF's website has pictures of like racially diverse families who are smiling and having a great time, and pictures of beautiful parks and trees. And so despite that sort of like happy, green, environmental, racially diverse image on the JNF website, what this looks like in terms of civil administration and funding for settlements is that the JNF supports and funds violent Jewish supremacist settlers to harass and assault Palestinians all over historic Palestine, in the West Bank, and elsewhere, expand their settlements, steal Palestinian homes, and take them over. And again, so like I said, if you go to the JNF website, right, they'll say that we fund fire departments. We fund and support services for disabled Israelis, construction projects, right? And then they're quite explicit about where they're doing that, which is, they say over and over again, this is outside like the busier, quote unquote, already established Israeli cities. This is for expansionist goals. They are funding this civil administration and propping up the construction of bigger and bigger and ever expanding settlements to again, further displace Palestinians and also expand Israeli control and move its population into wider and wider areas across historic Palestine. Really quickly, let's talk about the tax-exempt status of the JNF, and then I'm going to turn it over to Noura for talking about the JNF and its quite wild propaganda and the myth-making that perpetuates its propaganda. The tax-exempt status. So, like I said, the JNF, operates in obviously the state of Israel. But the JNF has like sister organizations or connected organizations, or like I should say, like maybe subsidiaries or chapters in other countries. So there's the JNF-USA, the JNF Canada. And in the US, the JNF-USA is a nonprofit organization. It's a 501c3, right? And that means this kind of organization collects donations for the JNF. This is to the tune of millions of dollars in donations that are tax exempt. This is profit, right? That it does not have to pay taxes on because it is a quote unquote nonprofit organization. And so the JNF is able to do that under the guise that it's a not-for-profit and sort of charity organization. This is how a continuation of the ways that it uses the law to continue to amass capital, to continue to dispossess Palestinians. And so, Naveen, you can go 2 slides forward. Talk about JNF in Canada. The JNF Canada chapter or subsidiary organization has been stripped actually of its charitable status in Canada. This is after multiple years long campaign and complaints to the Canadian version of the IRS that the JNF is actually not a charity organization. And after a investigation by the Canadian government, it was revealed that the JNF was doing things like giving money to the Israeli military and in fact, helping to expand illegal settlements. And so the Canadian version of the IRS stripped the JNF of its charity status. That is a decision that the JNF Canada is appealing. But just to say, this is the JNF's activities in working with and funding, sharing funds with the Israeli military, working to expand illegal settlements. I don't know if you can hear that, but there's a cat throwing up here. So that the JNF was doing those activities is actually against the law in many countries in terms of how a charity organization or a nonprofit organization gets established and what it's limited in doing in its activities. Okay, so that's the history of the JNF. I know that's like a quick and dirty and quite fast. I want to turn it over to Noura to talk about how the JNF and its massive propaganda machine.
Yes, thank you, Rhiannon. That was such an amazing rundown of the history. So you can go to the next slide.
Oh, sorry, I talked about that one. You can go to the next one.
Okay, so to talk about JNF propaganda, so this image right here kind of just says it all. How they, they put in bulletins in newspapers in order to continue to raise funds for their illegal campaigns that they've been doing since the beginning of their creation. But can you actually go to the next slide? Okay, so essentially, now we have like a really good grounding and understanding of the role that the JNF has played in spreading and uplifting the Zionist project more globally and throughout history. And it's important for us to understand how propaganda has played an integral role in these JNF land theft campaigns. So since the start, the JNF had developed a propaganda and education department with the goal of, quote, bringing Israel to the hearts of the people, which essentially, we understand as their way to really spread their propaganda and like essentially create buy-in for their Zionist ideology and the Zionist state. And so they achieve this goal through various means, but one of the most notable and primary roles from its inception was their infamous Blue Box campaign. So essentially what it was from their earliest days, they created these small donation boxes in order to collect large amounts of money in the US and in other countries as well. And so by World War II, there was like an estimated 2 to 3 million boxes that were distributed around the world. And the goal of these blue boxes weren't really just to collect funds for the crimes that they were committing, but also created a way to distribute and spread Zionist propaganda and ideology throughout the world. So their goal with these boxes essentially was to have every synagogue, every Jewish household, every school around the world to have these blue boxes in order to create this feeling of nationalism and pride for a state that at that time, like, like wasn't even like officially created. And so the blue box played a really major role in spreading this Zionist propaganda around the world. But this also wasn't only their only means of doing so. They also did this through various means of propaganda. They were kind of like their propaganda department was like essentially like a propaganda and myth-making machine. And so they created stamps that they would sell in order to help raise money. But again, as a primary means of propaganda, they would hire skilled writers and publishers in order to increase the production of literature, booklets, brochures, and pamphlets for people to spread around the world. And they would also translate these into different languages as well, so it's more accessible globally. They would also even experiment in the production of various games, films, and cinema. Some of these things were more successful than others, to which we'll see which ones they are continuing to do today. And you can actually go to the next slide. So this is just an example of a lot of the propaganda that we would see, throughout history, the creation of films. So on the very left-hand side of the screen, we see films that they would invest in order to uplift the Zionist project and their ideology. There are various iterations of stamps, and then they have this slogan of blooming the desert, which it says it in Hebrew, but that's what these posters are purporting. And you can go to the next slide. So in the years after 1948, we see the JNF shifting from distributing this idea of the state of Israel around the world to promoting and highlighting their greenwashing tactics in order to essentially speed up the erasure of Palestinians from their land after the Nakba. And so just as Rhiannon was mentioning earlier, how they started their afforestation projects, and they started them in the masses post-Nakba, they also shifted their propaganda strategy in order to highlight that. And so tree planting became known in Israel as like an Israeli national sport. And this is something that was uplifted by the JNF in order to, again, just clear any signs of the mass displacement that happened during the Nakba. We see these practices of afforestation, and we see these slogans of their greenwashing, starting to exist more and more. So, we see these different slogans such as making the desert bloom, the Jewish people's movement for the earth, calling Palestine an abandoned land, or, a land without a people for a people without a land. And so, this is essentially how the JNF would push their greenwashing campaigns, and, push forward their Zionist project during the time of the Nakba. They would really promote themselves as this environmental organization, and much of the experience that Americans and non-Palestinians in general have with the JNF is hearing about how the JNF, is a charity that plants trees in Israel, and how you can donate to plant a tree in Israel. Just like as Rhiannon mentioned, like if you go on their website, like you see all of these different pictures of trees and parks in order to greenwash the crimes that they commit. But of course, we understand that this is the laundering of what the JNF actually does, which is uprooting the native olive trees, and other Palestinian agriculture, planting non-native pine trees and forests, which, by the way, those pine trees require an excessive amount of water, which is contributing to drought in the region. and then also essentially poisoning the soil, which makes it even harder for plants to grow in that area, and for crops to be that, you know, many Palestinian farmers would use to make a living for themselves. And so, you know, on that note of Palestinian farmers and shepherds, you know, they couldn't have their cattle graze any longer because of the poison that the JNF has done to the land. And so, you know, we see this myth making and the mythologizing of colonization as a central aspect of their propaganda that we see today. And so this is just a screen grab of their website. Hold on, let me see what's in the chat. So when you say poisoning the land, exactly how? So essentially, through the planting of these pine trees that weren't native to the land, essentially it acidifies the soil, which allows it, I believe, to no longer have the same nutrients in the soil that native Palestinian agriculture would be able to grow in. Of course. So, okay, yeah, so this is a screen grab of their you know, their about page on their website. And so as you can see, you know, just like through this one paragraph, the JNF prides themselves on the crimes that they commit, and through planting more than 250 million trees since their inception. And so, you know, we understand that these trees are invasive trees, and it's on the Palestinian villages, and they continue to sustain this image through various programs around the world, but especially in the US. So it says that the JNF-USA is the single largest provider of Zionist programs in the US. And again, this is just how they continue to uplift their image and their charitable status that Rhiannon had mentioned. This is how they get their funds in order to continue with their land grabbing and their colonial projects that we see happening in Palestine. And you know, on the note of programming, you know, it's more than just this programming that they implement within the US, but it's also, you know, the creation of films, it's filmmaking. And actually after October 7th, the JNF-USA, there's a report out that says that they launched a campaign to invest $3 million in Israeli TV, filmmaking, and storytelling. And, you know, this is also in addition to the many journals that they publish, many booklets, and just like the broad amounts of propaganda that they produce worldwide. So they're investing $3 million extra in order to focus on spreading their propaganda through filmmaking and TV. And so, you know, this is just like a primary example of how they continue to use propaganda as a means to wash away the crimes of the Zionist entity, you know, to wash away the narrative of a genocide in our homeland. And we can see their active efforts and their active campaigns in order to do so. And so you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So, you know, as we've been iterating throughout this entire teach-in, the JNF is explicit about their expansionist aims. You know, it's not something that they hide on their website. You can see it, you know, in plain sight when you look into them. It's no secret. And the crimes of the this picture is what the crimes of the JNF materially look like. And so, you know, this is a picture of the old village of Safuria in Palestine, and what it previously looked like and what it looks like now. And this is a direct impact of the JNF. You know, so after 48 and after they destroyed the village of Safuria, like Rhiannon had mentioned, they remove all the rubble from the displacement campaigns that took place, and they planted a park. So I believe that this park is called Zipoli Park. And as you can see, like, you know, they are directly complicit in the ethnic cleansing and the total erasure of Palestinian existence on the land. And so, you know, if that history, if that understanding of what the JNF does, you know, doesn't get you riled up enough, we do want to talk a little bit about the conference and what the conference aims to accomplish this upcoming week. And you can go to the next slide. So, you know, we know that the JNF conference is happening from November 14th to the 17th in Dallas. And thank you, Fadia. Yes, Zipori. So this is supposed to be the world's biggest Zionist conference. You know, that's what they're marketing it as. And this is happening, of course, 1 year into the genocide on Gaza. And, you know, it is our responsibility to let them know that they are not welcome here in Dallas. But, you know, we wanted to walk through a few of the speakers that are going to be here next weekend. You know, just to iterate to y'all how, you know, how just, you know, aggravating it is and how unacceptable it is that these people are coming into our city. And so, again, some of the speakers include Yosef Haddad, Michael Rappaport, and Columbia University professor Shai David Dye. And so, you know, you don't even have to know who these people are exactly to know the anti-Palestinian and genocidal rhetoric that they push forward, not just through their social medias, but on public platforms and in Western media more broadly. And so these are just a few quotes. You know, Yosef Haddad, one very good example is, he says, Palestinians are animals, and you know what? If I am saying they are animals, I'm actually insulting the animals. So this is how the conference panelists and attendees view us as Palestinians. And again, they are not welcome in our city. And if you can actually go to the next slide, I want to give you guys a brief, you know, a brief summary to walk through some of the panels that they're going to be having next weekend, and why it's important for us to be disrupting at, you know, this whole conference throughout the entire weekend. So some of the panels include practical aspects of resilience in Israel during times of war, stars of the desert, the fabulous future of space, technology, and film in the Negev, Israel making the world a better place, security defense and the security of our homeland, living the Zionist dream, a day in the life of the world Zionist village. Theodore Herzl, he continues to inspire us today, to make a difference today. And whose land is it anyway? Indigenous people versus colonizers. So again, you know, this is just an example of some of the conversations that are going to be had next weekend at the JNF conference, and why it is critical for us to be confronting this conference and making sure that these panelists and that the attendees don't get any peace while they are here in Dallas. You know, again, like, it is our responsibility to do this, and it is one of our many duties here in the US to confront Zionism in any shape that it takes, and let them know that this is not a city where this conference is acceptable, and that this is not a city where they will feel welcome in again. You know, our goal is to make sure that they don't come back and that they have the worst time while they are here in Dallas, and that we, you know, actually disrupt this conference and make sure that they don't have these conversations that are contributing to the genocide and, you know, the broader land theft, the broader theft of our land. And so we have a few action items for everyone before, you know, before everybody logs off. Whether you are based in Dallas, whether you're based in Houston, or, you know, even if you're not in our region, we have a few action items on the next slide. So Naveen, if you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Oh, these are just a few more of the panels, but you can go ahead and skip this one. Okay, so for those that are here in Dallas, we have a long weekend of events for the JNF and for confronting the JNF. And so we encourage everybody to come out and to spread the word in the chat, or not in the chat, just more broadly with your broader friends, your family, people you know, and to continue to uplift this on social media as well. But you know, on the 14th, we're going to have a noise demonstration. The 15th, we're gonna do a few things. We're gonna do a chalk the block and a noise demonstration, essentially noise demos every night. And on the 16th, we have a mass protest at 1 p.m. In order to show that the masses stand with Palestine and that, again, it is unacceptable that this conference is happening here in Dallas. And then lastly, on the 17th, we're going to be doing a car rally. So make sure you guys get ready for all of these events, and, you know, get ready for a long weekend next week. And on the next slide, we just have a Telegram is it? Yeah, Telegram channel. Sorry, I forgot what it was called. In order to just stay up to date with what's happening around the JNF. So if y'all want to scan this QR code, you can also go to the tiny URL. It's called JNF Updates. In order to add yourself into this chat, this is where we're going to be updating on everything that's happening around the JNF in order for y'all to, again, stay up to date, and you know, just make sure that you are uplifting everything that is happening throughout next weekend. And you can go to the next slide. So lastly, one of our last action items for everyone, and this is an action item that everybody can take part in, whether you're in Dallas or not, is to email and call the Hilton Anatole to demand that they drop the JNF, and that that it is unacceptable for them to have this conference at their hotel. You know, share this with your friends and family, and, you know, take the time to do this. We've been demanding that the Hilton drop this conference for over a month now, and our demands have fallen on deaf ears, which is why we're going to be out there all weekend to show them that, you know, if you're not going to listen to our demands, then we're going to demand it ourselves. So, you know, make sure you guys take a screenshot of this, go to tinyurl.com/dropjnf and send out that email. It's an automatic one, so it's super easy, it's super quick, and you know, let's flood their lines, let's flood their emails so that the Hilton Anatole, you know, gets no rest either, you know, and they know that in the future that they, you know, they made a mistake allowing this conference to happen in their hotel. But that is all that we have for y'all today. So we want to thank you guys so much for, you know, joining us. I think there are a few questions. So I think we can go ahead and open it up. I think Nadine, if you want to go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, give me 1 second, y'all. Real quick, while I'm changing up a few settings here, we just want to give a little bit of a disclaimer that we know that there was like something mentioned in the chat that was inappropriate. So we went ahead and removed that person. I talked to, you know, the person whose name it is, and you know, we know them very well. They said that they were hacked, and that's not them, and you know, they're still trying to get into the waiting room. So I just want to let everyone know about that. But these things tend to happen. Let me go ahead, and I know Nadine, you have a question. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Are all of the action items for that week, are they all going to be at the Anatole, or were you guys going to be posting the locations in the Telegram?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So right now we're planning for all of these to be at the Hilton Anatole. Thank you, Nadine, for that question. And if there are any what is it called? If there are any changes that come up, or, you know, like we need to have a location shift, then you can follow any of the organizations in Dallas. I'm going to promote PYM just because that's the one I belong to, but PYM Dallas will be posting updates. Make sure you turn your post notifications on and any story notifications as well. I see, Patricia, you have a question as well. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Are there any plans about parking? Because that area, the parking's not good, and you obviously couldn't park in the hotel's parking lot. So is there any plans like to maybe meet somewhere else and maybe have like some kind of logistically transportation over to the hotel or anything else?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Patricia. Thank you. So right now we have a group that's working on logistics for these actions, and hopefully like we're going to be looking into like busing and like, you know, the different public transportation that is available nearby, because we know that the Hilton Anatole parking lot is a paid parking area, and we want to make sure that, you know, if you park in the neighborhoods surrounding that, you know, you won't get towed. So we're going to come up with a strong game plan. Again, follow PYM Dallas to continue to get updates on that. But yeah, any other questions? Awesome. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and close it out here. We really appreciate everyone for coming on. Again, if you want updates on the JNF, make sure you join our Telegram channel. Make sure you follow us and other organizations in Dallas in order to get updates. We're working in a broad coalition with organizations like Party for Socialism and Liberation, Dallas Anti-War Committee, Jewish Voices for Peace, all of whom we have like great relationships, and many more. And if there are any questions, you can always follow up via email, pymdallas@gmail.com. But thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.